Hello, everyone, and welcome to this installment of the Avert Research Network webinar series. As is customary, I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet. In my case, it's on the land of the Wurundjeri people, and I pay my respects to their elders past and present. So for today's webinar, we'll be addressing and discussing the October 7th terrorist attacks, where the Hamas organization killed more than 1,200 Israeli citizens and took over 200 people hostage. The October 7th attacks have been one of the most significant terrorist incidents in modern times and has led to an Israeli military operation that has had a profound impact and a high civilian death toll in Gaza, where Hamas controls and operates from. So I'd like to acknowledge at the outset that the impacts of the October 7th attacks have been widely felt across the globe, including here in Australia. Many people have been personally affected by what's happened in Israel and Gaza, and it's an emotional and highly polarized topic. So while understandably discussion of this might bring out a lot of emotions, our goal today is to offer an analytic discussion on Hamas, the organization that carried out the October 7th attacks, Israel's response to those attacks, and the global impacts of these events. And I can think of no better person to do that with than Professor Daniel Byman. Professor Dan Byman is likely very well known to many of you. He's a senior fellow at the Transnational Threats Project at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. He's also a professor at Georgetown University School of Foreign Service and the director of the Security Studies program. He's the foreign policy editor of the Lawfare blog and a part-time senior advisor to the Department of State. He's a leading national security expert and is the author of many publications and books, including A High Price, The Triumphs and Failures of Israeli Counterterrorism. Welcome, Professor Byman. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
So I'd like to just first start off our discussion today by asking you to just give us a brief primer on Hamas. Can you give us a very brief overview of the organization, when and why it was founded, what are its goals, who are its supporters, and maybe how the organization has evolved and changed over the years?
So Hamas grows out of the Muslim Brotherhood in the Gaza Strip. And the Muslim Brotherhood begins in Egypt. It's probably the premier political Islam movement in the Arab world. It has a lot of different permutations depending on which country you're in. And it is very harshly suppressed when Egypt controls the Gaza Strip between 1948 and 1967. When Israel takes the Gaza Strip in the 1967 war, that gives a lot more freedom for political Islam in general, in part because Israel saw its greatest threat as coming from more left-leaning, secular Arab nationalist types, and in part because Israel was simply more comfortable with having religion function on the Gaza Strip. And the Brotherhood starts to develop deep educational networks, religious networks, social welfare networks, and Palestinian politics at the time was dominated by Yasser Arafat and a number of secular movements, especially Arafat's Fatah movement. And as time goes on, the Brotherhood starts to become more interested in engaging in what it would call resistance, in violent politics. And in the early 1980s, it begins to organize in this way. But the key moment really is 1987. And this is when you have the first Intifada, which is largely peaceful, especially compared to its successor, the second Intifada, which begins in 2000. And Hamas is an outgrowth of the Muslim Brotherhood in Gaza. It declares itself and begins to do a series of attacks and other operations against Israel. And for the most part at this period, it's actually quite weak. It is, many of its leaders are arrested, and it does some attacks, but it's relatively limited. It becomes more relevant in the 1990s, ironically, when peace talks between Israel and Palestinian leaders like Arafat seem to be going very well. And what Hamas does, along with another group, Palestine Islamic Jihad, they do a series of attacks on Israel that disrupt the peace talks. And these attacks make it hard for many Israelis to trust Palestinian leaders. And they change the elections, where you go from a pro-peace candidate, Shimon Peres, who barely loses, to someone who's very critical of peace talks, a man beginning his political career at the time, Benjamin Netanyahu. And Netanyahu doesn't end peace talks, but he really slows things down. And Hamas continues low-level attacks, but it's not terribly successful for the second half of the 1990s. And then things shift again. In 2000, the second Intifada breaks out. At first, it's led by individuals and groups that are much more linked to the Palestinian Authority, to Fatah. But over time, Hamas becomes more and more important, in part because many of its leaders are released from jails that the Palestinian Authority ran. And there are operations Hamas does in the Second Intifada that are very important. But what I would really stress for this audience is it's the change in the narrative. Before 2000, Palestinian leaders could say to themselves, and more importantly to the Palestinian people, they're going to get a Palestinian state through negotiations. And that seemed very promising and had a lot of support among Palestinians. With the Second Intifada, with the violence, with the perception that Israel is not going to give in to Palestinian demands, Hamas's message that Israel only listens to force becomes much more relevant. There's a lot going on at this time period, but a couple of things I'd note. One is Yasser Arafat dies. So the traditional leader of the Palestinian national movement is gone, replaced by Mahmoud Abbas, who is very much for negotiations, but doesn't have the charisma or the personal stature of Arafat. Also, though, in 2000, Israel withdraws its forces from Gaza. And Hamas is able to claim victory. It says that this withdrawal didn't happen due to negotiations. It happened because of Hamas's steadfastness. And after the withdrawal in 2006, there are elections. And in these elections, Hamas wins. Now, it's a very close election. And Hamas doesn't even win a majority. But Fatah and associated groups really were poorly organized. So they would do things like run multiple candidates in the same district and split their own vote. But nevertheless, Hamas wins. And in 2007, there's a dispute about who's in control of parts of Gaza, and Hamas seizes power in Gaza. And so since 2007, Hamas has been the government of Gaza. And this has been a challenge for Hamas because it's trying to show that it can now govern the Palestinian Authority, that it's better at picking up the trash, it's better at law and order, very basic but important functions. But there have been Israeli restrictions, considerable restrictions, and also global restrictions on the government. So it's been hard for it to showcase its governing ability. But it also sees itself as a resistance organization. So it's done attacks on Israel, mainly rocket attacks. And so in this time period, Hamas had two phases, one as a government, one as a resistance organization. And it seemed, to bring us up to the present day, that many Israelis believed, and I want to confess, I believe this too, that Hamas was in a box, that it recognized that a massive attack on Israel would not work, would be counterproductive even, and that it was accepting of the reality that it was weaker than Israel and was trying to make marginal improvements in its situation. And that's the kind of perception before the October 7th attack.
So you've given us this really great broad overview. So how do the October 7th attacks kind of fit in terms of the goals that you had outlined that Hamas has?
So I want to stress there's a lot we don't know. So what I'm going to suggest now is, I hope, an educated guess, but we'll get more information as time goes on and we'll learn more. So I would say a few things. One is Hamas simply wouldn't accept that it was trapped in the box. So it is an organization that very much wanted to prove itself as the leader of the Palestinian national community. And it believed that the best way to do that was to double down or triple down on its resistance credentials. And that this would be a way of distinguishing itself from other Palestinians and showing that it could act where they could not. In addition, Hamas receives money, training, funding from Iran. And it's unclear if Iran was directly behind the October 7th attacks, but Iran has supported Hamas attacks on Israel in general by building up its capabilities. And Iran very much wants the narrative that's happening right now in the greater Middle East, which is before it was about Syria and countries like that and Iran's support for that. Now it's much more about the United States and Israel and the bad things that they are doing to ordinary Palestinians. So this is a win for Hamas. So this is a win for Hamas to sponsor Iran. In addition to all this, there's a genuine, I'll even say, hatred of Israel. And I don't think October 7th was simply because Hamas hates Israel, but I think they are very pleased with the concept that Israel has suffered. They feel Palestinians have suffered and the world has stood by. And now there is payback, if you will. And a broader general view that Israel is an illegitimate state. And to me, that's an important condition of all this, where the idea that many people in the world are looking at Israel with sympathy, Hamas would simply say, look, they are killing Palestinians on a daily basis. Now they understand what it's like. So I think it's a mix of factors shaping this, but I would really stress the intra-Palestinian environment and how Hamas wants to distinguish itself and felt that it couldn't do so under the conditions that were present in Gaza before October 7th.
Right. And there's also been a lot of debate in terms of what prompted the October 7th attacks. So I'm wondering if you could give us your assessment of this. Do you think it was in response to a very specific or immediate issue or dynamic that was going on, either between Palestinians and Israelis or regionally? Or do you think it was more of a matter of long-term planning that kind of met a particular opportunity?
So I believe it was more long-term planning, meeting an opportunity, that this was a moment where that Hamas, there's some estimates that this took over 2 years to put this operation together. And every day that it didn't happen was a day that there was a risk of it being discovered. So they had this capability on the shelf, but its actual shelf life was unclear. I can't look at October 7th and say, aha, this is a moment that is different than October 6th or September 7th or July 7th. So I think it was more Hamas developed an option and it felt that the option was ready and that the conditions for other approaches, political approaches and so on, simply weren't working. And that now was the time to launch it.
So to that, there's been a debate about whether the process of normalization between Israel and some of the Arab states has kind of had galvanized Hamas to conduct this attacks. Do you take any stock in that assessment, or what role did the regional dynamics play, if any?
So I don't think Hamas itself was tremendously focused on the normalization, say, between Saudi Arabia and Israel, but I would say a couple of things. One is Iran was very much focused on this. This normalization was in part directed against Iran. Previous arrangements, such as the Abraham Accords, were very much directed against Iran. So Iran had a lot of incentive to try to spoil this sort of normalization. And more broadly, from Hamas's point of view and the Palestinian point of view, they felt somewhat forgotten. That yes, there were many people in the Arab world who remained and were staunchly pro-Palestinian, but that wasn't what the attention of regional governments and regional actors were focused on. They were focused on regional civil wars. They were focused on environmental issues. They were focused on a range of things as opposed to the traditional emphasis on the Palestinians. And so I do think the international environment played into Hamas's thinking in that their belief is they can force change in Israel through a combination of hurting the Israelis sufficiently and international pressure. And before October 7th, neither of those were present. Right? Israelis could go about their daily lives without really thinking of Hamas and the threat it posed. And the international community seemed not to be focused on the Palestinians. And now both of those have changed. And perhaps from Hamas's point of view, that is a win.
Yeah, so that also gets us to another dynamic of the October 7th attacks, where that this has been, even though there's been a longstanding conflict between Israel and Hamas, the October 7th attacks also represented a strategic surprise for Israel. And so I'm wondering, what do you think that Israeli security officials and political leaders missed, and why?
So I'll also have the caveat there's a lot we don't know here. But there's several possibilities. So at the very least, there was an assumption, and again, I want to be clear that I share this, that Hamas did not have the capacity to carry out such an attack because it would have been detected by Israeli intelligence. And there was a perception that Gaza had been thoroughly penetrated by Israeli intelligence, and that, yes, there might be an occasional surprise here or there, but it would be in the realm of some rockets being launched or maybe a raid as opposed to something of the scope and scale of a massive rocket attack and a massive cross-border attack, both of which required a huge amount of preparation, a huge amount of people. And those things are typically easier to detect. So one was an assumption that Hamas couldn't have been able to pull this off without detection, and obviously that was wrong. And there may have been a circularity to this, where Israel, before all this, I wrote an article, 8 months ago, warning of a huge increase in Israeli-Palestinian violence, but it was about the West Bank, right? And I was focused on a different part of this dispute. So people who are watching the Palestinian issue were focused on the West Bank. People were very concerned about an Israeli-Hezbollah clash. And so there was a sense that Hamas is largely contained. Israel has an anti-rocket system that's very effective. And therefore, the analytic energy, perhaps the intelligence collection tools, although I don't know, should be focused in other areas. So the concept that Gaza in general is acceptable from an Israeli point of view may have led them to change their intelligence collection and analysis in a way that led them to miss things. So those are some of the possibilities I would raise. But I do want to stress that there will be, I think, very thorough investigations of this on the Israeli side, and we're going to learn a lot more.
So I'm wondering if I could go back to something you had mentioned earlier about Hamas and its operations in Gaza. Can you tell us a bit about how Hamas is perceived in Gaza? What do Gazans think of Hamas in terms of its legitimacy and its claim to be the standard bearer of Palestinian resistance? And did the October 7th attacks either help or hurt Hamas in this regard?
So by chance, we actually have fairly good polling. And Amani Joal of Princeton, she and a colleague did polling of both Gaza and the West Bank that ended on October 7th, right? So it's, from the point of view of researchers, it's extremely useful. And it found that support for Hamas hovered around 30%. Now, there are two ways to look at this, and I actually think the media coverage of this was wrong. So the media coverage tended to say Hamas was unpopular because 70% of Gazans were not supporters. And that's a true statement. But the real question to me is not, do people support Hamas, yes or no? It's, do they support it more than the alternatives? And the alternatives were much worse off, right? So I forgot the numbers exactly, but the Palestinian Authority, I think, was around 12% or something like that. So while people were not particularly supportive of Hamas, they were less supportive of its rivals. And so I think that's the situation Hamas found itself in, which is, it wasn't about to lose power, right? It both controlled police and coercion in general, and had enough supporters where it would be okay and didn't have rivals. But that said, it was slowly losing its legitimacy. We don't have the same kind of high quality data polling after October 7th, but there's a lot of anecdotal reporting. And in the short term, at least, it appears that this has been a big success for Hamas. And there are two different reasons for that. The first is that, as we're seeing right now, Hamas is delivering. That not only have Israelis suffered, as many Palestinians believe is appropriate, but Israel is freeing Palestinian prisoners, and it's happening because of the Hamas attack. So Hamas can say, we've produced results in contrast to the Palestinian Authority. So violence works, negotiation fails. The second reason is the ferocity of the Israeli response has vindicated Hamas's message that Israel is brutal and simply the only language Israel understands will be force, and that there needs to be blood for blood. Now, I will say on that last bit, what has happened in many cases historically is there's an initial surge in anger at Israel about the destruction. But over the long term, there's anger at Hamas because people say, yes, it's Israel's fault that my house was destroyed, but Hamas deliberately provoked this. So there's a real question to be about whether the short-term increase in support for Hamas due to the Israeli destruction will translate into long-term support. But a lot of that depends, to go back to my original point, on someone else being there to benefit politically. Right? If the answer is Hamas or the completely discredited Palestinian Authority, many people are going to pick Hamas. And so if there is no alternative, then it matters less whether Hamas has a slight increase or slight decrease in popularity.
So following on from that, after this October 7th attacks, Israeli officials, they have publicly stated that their objective in response to this terrible attack was to destroy Hamas. Do you think that that is a realistic goal? And what's the cost of trying to achieve that goal? And so I suppose I'm asking what your assessment is around the proportionality and potential effectiveness of Israel's response in terms of achieving any lasting solutions.
So I'm going to start with really a definitional question. So what does it mean for Hamas to be destroyed? And you could have a lot of different answers to that, right? One is its senior leadership is killed. Another is a lot of its fighters are either killed, or the Wall Street Journal had a piece today saying one plan being discussed was, could you exile the fighters, right? Send them far away, as happened when Israel went to Lebanon in the early 1980s. So those are different ways of thinking about destruction. Another way is that someone else governs Gaza, right? So Hamas is gone as the effective government of Gaza. And the last is that an ideology of resistance is gone. And there are kind of two ways of thinking about that. One is there is another ideology, ideally, in my view, peaceful negotiation, that takes its place. Some of the extreme right in Israel would say, no, you want to make Palestinians hopeless about violent change. You want to convince them that it will never work. And therefore, even if they want, if this is their preference, they know it's impossible. I think all these goals are really hard. Israel can definitely kill Hamas leaders. And it's quite possible that even after the current military campaign ends, you might see an assassination campaign continue over the years. But Hamas has a lot of leaders. And it's a very large organization with many followers and many supporters. And so even if Israel kills, dozens, hundreds of Hamas leaders, there will be more. It's not an infinite bench, but it's a very, very large bench. So I think that even I'll say the simplest task, which is simply going after leadership, will be very difficult. And given Hamas's deep networks in Gaza, its political, religious, social networks, its government networks, I think this is an extremely hard task for Israel to accomplish. And the question then becomes, well, if it can't eliminate Hamas, can it weaken Hamas? And here's where the military campaign comes in. And this is something that Israel is trying to find Hamas fighters, trying to find Hamas leaders, trying to destroy weapons caches, trying to destroy its military infrastructure. All that's exceptionally hard in a built-up urban environment. And this is hard for the best militaries in that they lose a lot of their advantages in terms of intelligence. They lose a lot of their advantages in terms of mobility. It gives Hamas a lot of opportunities for ambush. Hamas's tunnel network is very valuable to surprise attacks and protecting it. And Israel has been trying to destroy all this, but it's been doing so with a large population of Gazans there. And many have been displaced, and many have been killed. And this question of proportionality, I mean, at times I think the legal definition of proportionality gets confused, I think, with the common usage of it, right? So from a legal side, the question is Israel inflicting damage first intended to hit military targets? And second, if it is trying to hit those military targets, is the objective of what it's hitting proportionate to the cost in civilians? So under this general interpretation of proportionality, killing civilians is actually allowed, as tragic as that is. It's really a question of numbers relative to the value of the targets. It's hard to know because it's hard to know what exactly has been hit, but the civilian numbers are huge, right? There's kind of no way to look at these numbers, especially the number of children, and not think about how horrible and how tragic this is. So I don't have full information on kind of which targets Israel is hitting or what its objectives are, but to me, there should be a lot of hard questions asked about Israel's military campaign and what it's trying to achieve, given the level of destructiveness.
So to that point, the Israeli military operations and counterterrorism strategy against Hamas and other terrorist organizations that also are in Palestine, particularly after the October 7th attacks. They've been heavily criticized by many in the international community due to these concerns that you point out about violations of human rights and violations of international laws of war. You dealt with these issues directly in a book that you wrote a while back, A High Price, The Triumphs and Failures of Israeli Counterterrorism. How do you assess Israel's strategy in terms of its current and long-term impacts?
So Israel has always faced a dilemma between, I see it as two different approaches to counterterrorism. So approach one is, can you somehow shift, in this case, the people, the Palestinian people, and move them away from what they would call resistance in favor of peaceful negotiations? And part of that is being willing to negotiate. Part of it is having a government that is open to negotiation. And so it's kind of big questions of changing, I'll say, conditions for all of Gaza or really all of Palestine. A second approach is that there are a relatively small number of skilled leaders and members of terrorist groups. And if you kill or arrest those, you greatly weaken the group. And you may still have hundreds or thousands or tens of thousands of people who hate you. But if they are not led by skilled people, if they are not organized properly, they'll be much less effective. And so Israel has gone back and forth with these approaches. So when it embraced peace negotiations, it was much more about how do we solve this in a more complete sense. But when peace negotiations fell apart, Israel went for the how do we weaken these organizations. But the problem is the weakening the organization approach often makes the longer term change the government, change societal conditions more difficult. For example, the very large number of civilian casualties in Gaza is going to create a generation, at least, of Palestinian anger, right? And make negotiations on the Palestinian side extremely hard. Create lots of volunteers for violent organizations. So Israel's view may be, look, negotiations will never work. Therefore, let's just keep these groups weak and off balance. But if you have hope, as I do, perhaps naively, that there actually may be a solution to this conflict at some point in our future, then you want to start looking at broader impacts on society.
So one of the things that struck me about what's going on with this ongoing conflict, particularly in this moment, is the role of dehumanization. So this is a historical, political, military struggle between Palestinians and Israelis over territory, right? But it's also one in which dehumanization really stands out. We've also seen how dehumanization plays out in terms of how international supporters and partisans for each side advocate for their respective sides, for lack of a better term. I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about that, and what does it say about the kinds of information warfare or narrative battle that's accompanying kind of the military counter-terrorist aspects of this conflict?
No, I think that's a great question, and one of the worst problems of this is you don't see people acknowledging the horror on the other side, right? So to me, it is a perfectly reasonable statement to say Israel's policies towards the Palestinians have been wrong. Palestinians have rights, whether it's to an own state or broader humanitarian concerns, but that doesn't justify going in and killing 1,200 people, many of them elderly or children. It doesn't justify kidnapping, and that people need to be very clear about that. Conversely, people need to be very clear about the suffering on the Palestinian side, the deaths of children, and it needs to be recognition that there's humanity on both sides. And this is something that is increasingly lacking in this. And conflict makes worse, right? When you're wounded, when your community is hurt, it's hard not to see the other side as lacking in fundamental values. And talking about narratives, we tend to consume certain narratives that we often agree with. So we're often, listening to news that reinforces our existing biases. We're not seeing the suffering on the other side because of what we choose to consume. The people we listen to are sending certain messages. So I see this as a tremendous problem. And again, a lasting one that, 3 years from now, say, that people will have very different understandings of exactly what happened. that there'll be different views as to why this attack occurred and its consequences that are effectively different sets of facts, not just different interpretations of these facts, but very different sets of facts. And that to me, that's a tremendous problem.
And so what would you have to say in terms of how this conflict is also playing out in other areas, say particularly in the West, in terms of radicalizing others to action or playing into people's propensity to commit violent extremist attacks, either in support of one side or the other?
So we're already seeing, of course, violent demonstrations. We've seen some horrific attacks that have sometimes been simply vandalism or minor assault. But in the United States, we saw a Palestinian, or not Palestinian, excuse me, we saw a Muslim American child murdered. We saw attacks on 3 students shot. Right, we saw things that, as horrific as assault or vandalism is, we saw things much worse, and we're seeing violent demonstrations around the world. This is a very emotional issue. And the nature of the Hamas attack, the atrocities that Hamas seemed to deliberately commit, have understandably and appropriately outraged people. And on the other hand, people who are sympathetic to the Palestinian cause are seeing a news diet of this incredibly destructive Israeli military campaign. And so it is inspiring low-level acts of violence, and I would say for the most part, disorganized violence. To my knowledge, we've seen certain terrorist groups call for violence, but we haven't seen them direct violence. And that's good news in my view, because the groups tend to be more skilled, they tend to be more organized. But the amount of, I'll say, energy and anger is considerable. And I can easily imagine, an additional horror on one side or the other, creating the impetus for further violence.
So if I could take it back to the region, in the immediate aftermath of the October 7th attacks, there was a lot of concern that this might escalate to a wider regional war. I'm just wondering if you could tell us about what the basis for those concerns are, and does that risk remain? In your assessment, has the prospect for regional conflict either escalated or diminished based on what we've seen over the past month?
So the initial concern we boil down to 2 issues. That you might see groups like Hezbollah join the fray, and you might see groups or individuals in the West Bank or elsewhere kind of rise up in certain ways. And part of this was simply Iran, that Iran provides support for Hamas, and Iran is very close to Hezbollah and a number of other groups. So there was a question, which is, if Iran was behind this attack, which is a question mark, then why wouldn't Iran encourage other proxies to attack? So that was one concern. The second concern was that this is such an emotional issue that you'll see various political organizations, including militant organizations, want to be associated with Hamas. And we saw this with Hezbollah, for example, where Hezbollah did attacks on Israel that were designed to show solidarity with Hamas. Now, the good news is there have been limits. So yes, Hezbollah did these attacks, but it actually seemed to try to calibrate them, to send a message that it was trying to stay within certain boundaries, that it was doing limited attacks on Israel, but wasn't going to escalate. We saw the leader, the Secretary General of Hezbollah, Hassan Nasrallah, give this major speech where he made it very clear that Hezbollah had not been involved in the October 7th attacks. And so there have been a desire, I think, of these organizations to avoid escalation. And part of that is they fear the consequences of Israel treating Beirut as devastating as has happened in Gaza. And so I think there's more hope, and that the situation will not spread than there was on October 7th. The only caveat I'd say is, whenever you have military operations going on, there's a lot of uncertainty. So yes, Hezbollah may be trying to signal to to Israel that it's doing limited attacks. But if a Hezbollah attack, instead of hitting an Israeli border post, hits an Israeli school bus, that's a very, very different sort of, I'll say, threat that Israel would feel. And Israel has responded quite harshly to Hezbollah attacks. And Hezbollah could say, look, Israel seems to be going 100%. So why should we hold back? So I think there's been signaling on both sides that they want to both stand tough yet show restraint. But it's very easy for these signals to be misinterpreted. And so I think there's still a legitimate concern about escalation, even though I think the major actors don't want to escalate.
So to wrap up our session, I'd like to ask you just a last question. You've studied Hamas for many decades, and likewise the Israeli counterterrorism apparatus and strategy. I'm wondering if the October 7th attacks and the Israeli response have prompted any fundamental reconsideration or reassessment of either one for you.
So certainly, I thought Hamas was more focused on governing Gaza, and frankly was more sensitive to the lives of Palestinians there, that it did this massive attack knowing Israel would have a very tough response. And so I had misjudged Hamas, and someone who studied it for a long time, to me that is a significant issue in my own analysis. The Israeli response, to me, a big question I'm pondering and thinking about is the politics within Israel, where I've argued earlier that I don't think Israel has good options in terms of destroying Hamas, but it has to balance a furious domestic political sentiment with its broader strategic sense of the problem. And that's always been a problem for Israel, which is been very sensitive to politics and how it's conducted counterterrorism. And so that's an issue on the Israeli side I'm watching very closely.
Well, Professor Byman, thank you so much for joining us for this webinar. It's been really informative. Thanks for spending the time with us. And I want to thank everybody also, too, for listening in and joining us for this latest installment of our webinar series. You can always find out more information about the Avert Network on our website, avert.net.au. And we look forward to seeing you next time. Thank you all so much.